Last time, we covered the previously controversial Until Resume sequel to a game that was incredibly mediocre and frustrating. From here on out, there was a pathway for EA to expand their horizons and allow other developers other than DICE to experiment with the series. At this point, we had two incredibly controversial, contentious shooters in a row, so they had to do something different. After being in critical shambles, EA published two more Star Wars games, released back-to-back in 2019 and 2020. We're covering these games today, starting with the single-player adventure, Jedi Fallen Order. For Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, they had to make a single-player action-adventure game. However, they decided to get Respawn Entertainment to create the game. Initially, I found this to be a really weird decision at first, considering that they also just made shooters and not really a lot of single-player adventures. The only single-player thing that Respawn is even really memorable for is like Titanfall 2's campaign, to be honest. Anyways, I remember being like almost 14 years old when this game was announced, and I thought this game was a fucking joke. From what it seemed, I thought the game would be cancelled or something, like, I don't know, Star Wars 1313. Trailers afterwards just made things feel even worse, because it just made the game look so casual because of how basic it's all seemed. And I don't mean like casuals like me, I mean the casuals. It just felt like another boring licensed game. Nothing seemed like it would be fun or cohesive. I'm glad that I was absolutely wrong about this game being boring, because this game is actually fucking great. Jedi Fallen Order was a surprisingly good game, not just because of my expectations being extremely low, but because this game was actually so much more than the sum of its parts. Jedi Fallen Order is better than it had any right to be. Anyway, I'm not explaining the plot in depth, because the last time I tried that I made the videos too long. So, short explanation, you're playing as a fugitive from Order 66, Cal Kestis, who works at a scrapyard, but then one day uses the Force to save a friend. After a while, the second and ninth sister Inquisitors hold a contraband inspection to find who the Jedi is, and Cal reveals himself after his friend is killed by the second sister. He then meets up with the Mad TV lady and escapes, and they plan on retrieving a MacGuffin called the Holocron. From here on out, Cal and the crew find the Holocron and come to terms with their pasts, and learn to build a better future and trust each other and whatnot. The game's story isn't really all that original, but it's still incredibly refreshing. Initially, it just pretty much seems like the man on the run with trust issues story that we've seen a million times, but it's just so incredibly nuanced. I really like the central characters, Cal Kestis and Seer Junda. I love that Cal wasn't exactly perfect. I love that he was kind of clumsy and dorky at times. Even the way he swings his lightsaber is a mix of frantic improvisation and smooth, elegant focus. I won't say he's the deepest character ever, or even in this franchise, but he's not a generic self-insert, although he is still mildly relatable. He's not devoid of struggle or really annoying like a lot of recent Star Wars protagonists either. He actually goes through shit. And while yes, he does overcome it eventually, it is still very rewarding when he has. Then we also meet Seer, who at first seems like the character that the writer just forces to be trustworthy, but then we realize that she has skeletons in her own closet. I like that even though Cal is disappointed in Seer for not telling the truth, they don't do the weird DreamWorks third out breakup thing where they just force conflict or just make her a random twist villain or something. They actually allow Seer to make amends in this game, which is really nice. I will say that the other characters don't really have all that much to do, but they don't hog the screen time either. I like that they have a role, but they aren't overused comic reliefs. Also, BD1 is fucking wholesome and we need marketable plushes of him or something. That's all I need to say. They also have really good voice acting and a few moments of levity. Also, Marin is here and she's clearly some sort of shipping bait. You can tell just through the game's dialogue, to be honest. She doesn't really have all that much to do, but I like her story, I guess. The way that she already hasn't trusted Malicos after he lied to her several different times is still not original, but it's well done. While a lot of the characters that help the heroes aren't all that impressive, the villains are far more interesting, or fun, even if some don't have the screen time. Malicos was a Jedi that got corrupted by the dark side after being on Dathomir for years. The Ninth Sister is pretty much just intimidating, even though she lacks depth, but she's at least well voice acted, and I'm alright with that one. And the second sister is probably the best antagonist in this game with the most depth. It turns out the second sister is Trilla, who was Seer's Padawan that was kidnapped by the Imperials. After being tortured, she became an Inquisitor. This twist was done really well in my opinion. Trilla was genuinely terrifying from start to finish in this game. and giving her a motivation on top of that was purely genius on the writing. I don't think every villain needs to have some grandiose take over the world plan with some random sympathetic reason, like wanting the universe to be balanced or something. And they can just be pure evil and have a personality, but melding the two is a bit of a hard task. The only real issue I have with Trilla is something I've noticed far too many times with Star Wars villains, especially in recent years. She unmasked herself way too early. I totally get why they did this, since they paced her arc well enough throughout this one game, and also it's easier to emote when you're showing your face versus putting on a mask. But that's also why we like these masked characters too. I honestly would have liked to see more of her with her helmet on, but I mean, I guess we can just unmask early. I know it's not all that bad, but it's just something I've noticed. The story in this game is fairly good and well written. It's not perfect or anything, and it's not really deep at all, but it knows what it is and it excels at making a simple story feel quote-unquote deep. When people talk about a lot of modern licensed games with good stories, this is definitely one of those games. I think along with Spider-Man, the Batman Arkham games, Guardians of the Galaxy, and shit, even Epic Mickey, this is among them in terms of quality of storytelling. There are obviously a few issues, but there are still enough moments for me to actually feel like it was a great story. We might have seen some of these moments brought to life before, especially in this series, like accepting your destiny, not running away from your past, confronting your past, being trustworthy, trusting others, finding your destiny, but at the same time, I just don't care. The story is so good, and the pacing makes it even better. So yeah, overall, the story is actually really good, and probably the best Star Wars story at this point that we've had in, what, 11 years? Anyway, that's enough gushing about the story in this video game. Let's actually talk about the gameplay in this video game. I'll just say, for people who want to get the best out of this game, please play on Jedi Master or Jedi Grandmaster difficulty. I have a weird feeling that that E3 trailer was on Jedi Knight difficulty, because shit, it looked so easy. This game's combat is pretty simple, but it's fairly fun. Just like the story, a lot of the gameplay is not exactly original in terms of mechanics, or even how they're implemented, but truthfully, Star Wars games have had many inspirations. Sometimes it's inspired by Battlefield, sometimes it's God of War, I guess, and sometimes it's an MMO for some reason. Jedi's inspiration here was definitely Dark Souls, with a little bit of Sekiro with how the parrying works. This is the only game that, without any joke, is totally the Dark Souls of Star Wars games, because it's pretty obvious. It's not because it's just brutally difficult, it can be obviously, but it's because it just has a lot of the Souls-like feeling to it. And a lot of the mechanics, like the bonfire save point things. Or how the combat works, except you're not pressing triggers and bumpers. Also, the inspiration doesn't really stop there. The inspiration also comes from other games, like Tomb Raider and Uncharted in some sections. The main inspirations were definitely Metroidvanias though, and totally the Soul series, especially Sekiro with its parry system. I'll talk about the platforming and set pieces first. The platforming works surprisingly well, in spite of the obvious Tomb Raider and Uncharted inspiration. The platforming is precise and fairly gratifying, although the climbing is a bit much, but at least you can speed run through it if you just spam jump. And also you can automatically attach to walls, you know, that's like an option in the settings. I think the Metroidvania-esque design actually worked really well in this game. I usually don't really like it all that much because it requires a ton of backtracking, revisiting the same areas, but I really like that you can explore different parts of the world when you get back to Zepho, Dathomir, Kashyyyk, or Bogano. Especially Zepho, Dathomir, and Kashyyyk. They also have a ton of collectibles too, but there's a slight issue with that. See, the collectibles are usually stuff like lightsaber customization material and cosmetic stuff, along with skins for BD1. The problem with it is that the collectible skins are just so negligible and dull. What the sequel seems to be fixing is the customization, to the point where you can actually just straight up make a whole new fucking Cal Kestis. What the hell? Because goddamn, the items in this game are just so boring to look at. Like, I literally could just wear the same thing throughout the entire game, and it wouldn't matter all that much. I usually switch between just the jacket and the scrapyard coat. And judging by how they look, the game doesn't really inspire me to just go out and collect them. I just don't really care all that much. However, these lightsaber colors are pretty decent. They're standard, but visually cool enough to look at, and makes the game feel like it has visual variety somewhat. They don't really change all that much, but they're a really cool addition. Oh yeah, anyways, that's a really great segue into the combat. Woohoo! I like the lightsaber combat because while it's not the flashiest, it's really intricate and fun. The feeling of swinging a lightsaber is swift, and parrying is smooth and satisfying. I feel like Sekiro had better parrying because of just how it feels. Something about it's pretty inexplicable. But Jedi Fallen Order is still mechanically sound in that regard. The game has a lot of moves to unlock, and it's through the skill tree. My only real issue is that you don't really have to use these abilities, and by the end of the game, yeah, it's like they're kinda useless, but they're at least fun for the sake of variety, and they're at least cool to look at. This game's enemy variety is pretty decent in general. I really like how they make the basic stormtroopers pretty pathetic and easy to kill, but allow them to be farther, allowing you to parry their bullets. Every other enemy, though, is a lot harder to fight, and that's really fair considering this game's inspiration. I also like that the mini-bosses become normal enemies after you fight them for the first time. It really allows you to learn how the enemies attack and allows you to dodge and parry certain attacks that they throw at you. The best part of combat are the bosses, specifically against lightsaber-wielding characters. The best ones are Malicos, Ninth Sister, and Trilla, who are honestly the only ones with any sort of lightsabers. I really like how Trilla has the best build-up. There are many fights with her, and up until the final encounter, each is pretty much scripted to end at a certain point. This at first seems weird and constrictive, but eventually it feels so satisfying after progressing. And it really is kind of a weird sort of Ludo character development for Cal, because it shows how in the game he also gets stronger and more confident, as well as with the story. You see, Ludo narrative cohesion exists, god damn it. These fights are kinda like Souls, but they aren't contingent on weird patterns and are really just straight up duels sometimes. That's not an issue though, because the game is actually challenging and has the most depth during the bosses. You can either go the slow and methodical route, and parry each attack while attacking at their shield, or you can find an opening and with sheer player aggression, beat them. It's an absolutely genius system, and it was always satisfying to not just beat an enemy, but overcome by using your mind and strategizing where you should strike. Thing is, you shouldn't think way too hard, because if you do, it can cost you your health bar. Also, you can make these fights really look pretty damn cool outside of QTEs. These are the best parts of the game, honestly, and I always wonder when the next boss fight will occur after beating one. No, I'm not a masochist, I swear. Also, the visuals are really good too. The thing about this game is that it was pushing last-gen systems really hard. Unlike the Battlefront games, this one doesn't use the Frostbite engine, and uses the Unreal engine, which isn't awful, but can produce some pretty undesirable effects, especially when pushing the last-gen consoles to their limits. Sometimes there's pop-in or textures not loading properly, or frame rate dips, but this mostly happens when exploring these pseudo-open worlds, and not really during stuff like bosses. I think Kashyyyk was probably the worst of the worlds in terms of pushing the hardware. Thankfully, if you play on Xbox Series X or PS5, you'll have less of these issues, but there are still some visual bugs here and there. This game is beautiful and artistically great, but technically it left a lot to be desired. But at the same time, this is also released on the latter half of the console generation, so that's fine. Overall, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is definitely the best of EA's Star Wars games that they released. It had a great story, amazing art, fun and compelling combat, great set pieces, etc. It was probably the best Star Wars game in 14 years at that point. And honestly, I can't wait for the sequel coming this month. I know this is the most flaccid way to end the video, but honestly, I don't really have any feelings towards Squadrons. I think it's perfectly fine, but the story is just not really my thing, and the gameplay style is just not for me at all. In the 3 hours I spent playing it, I just never felt the impact of this game like others did. I think it's mediocre and dull, but not because it actually has genuinely awful mechanics, but because I just don't care about it. I'll say it has decent space combat, but even Battlefront 2 does this pretty well. I don't really have any issues rooted in anything with this game, in terms of mechanics, outside of some mild jank from time to time. I have nothing to say about the story, because this game is very much the most spin-off-y game in this entire retrospective, if that makes any sense. But it just feels so small scale that I just don't care that much. We've seen the post-Order 66 thing quite a bit now, so I was kind of tired of it, to be honest. Sorry for disappointing the two people that cared about my thoughts about Star Wars Squadrons, but I think the game is pretty inoffensive and boring, but it's not horrible or anything. I could totally understand there being an audience for this, and there was. I'm just not part of that audience, and that's okay. This game was just not my style, so yeah, sorry I clickbaited you guys, not that any of you are watching this anyways, but I'm sorry? At least the visuals look pretty good. And holy shit, that's it! Well, time for the concluding statements. EA is not at all the best company due to their terrible corporate practices, time crunches, addition of monetization when it's not necessary, and so on. However, it feels like with each subsequent release, it improved in some way, or another even when it wasn't my cup of tea. 3 studios made at least one game that made an impact, one way or another. I think that even though I found Battlefront 2015 to be incredibly disappointing, and Squadrons to be okay, it felt like it had some sort of audience. EA was totally a looming force among the developers, and in a sense was kind of responsible for the screw-ups of each game. But in spite of that though, the developers under the control of EA did a pretty damn good job for the most part. Still much better than Battlefield 2042